right, so this is our third installment on the Gilded Age. And in this video, we're gonna cover segregation. We're gonna cover basically the New South as a whole, which includes segregation. We're going to talk about politics during the Gilded Age, specifically looking at some of the presidents, the political parties, and just kind of close out the entire topic. So when the Civil War is over, the South is in pretty bad shape. As you can imagine, their economy is devastated. They've lost several 100,000 men killed, countless more wounded and disabled. But the South is going to go into a transitional period from this point. Cotton, while it's still king, there's some changes going to be made. The biggest one, of course, is going to be how that cotton is actually grown and, harvested. Of course, before the Civil War and through most of the Civil War, it was the institution of slavery. After the Civil War, we're going to move into sharecropping, tenant farming, where these former slaves will basically rent land from former slave owners on former plantations. They'll process the cotton for a share of the profit that was made from growing that cotton. Now, that's the pretty picture. On the other side of things, there's going to be black codes that are going to be instituted, which are going to require African Americans to hold a job. It's going to be the first step in African Americans becoming second-class citizens throughout this time period and through the civil rights period. Cotton mills are going to spring up across the South. They'll hire white men, white women, and limitedly, black men will be hired in the cotton mills too. They'll have different types of jobs, but they'll be in there as well, but those will be strictly segregated. Here we have some mines that are going to be in operation in the South, mostly in West Virginia and up in that area, Kentucky. You'll have some mining, but primarily agriculture is going to remain king in the South during this time period. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about Jim Crow and segregation. All right, so we have at the end of the Civil War, we have Reconstruction. We have the South is going to be relegated to a second-class statehood, if you will. They'll be occupied by Army troops for several years. And then we move into the Southern states begin to, they call it redeeming themselves. The Redeemer governments come in, which are going to be run by Southern Democrats. And these folks will be, I guess, for a lack of better words, they'll be instituting revenge on what they see as perceived negative consequences from the war itself, and a lot of that's going to be focused on the black community. Segregation will basically focus on places like we've already talked about: workplaces, schools, restrooms, lunch counters eventually, dressing rooms, swimming pools in the near future, water fountains, and things of that nature. Now, Plessy v. Ferguson, the lawsuit, or the Supreme Court case, I should say, is going to make this accepted with their phrase, separate but equal, become kind of the law of the land. And this is not just in the South. This is also, there is segregation in the North. It's just on a different level. In the South, it was actually law. In the North, it was de facto, it was practiced. We're going to have several leaders that are going to come onto the forefront during this time period. We're going to have Booker T. Washington, famous for education, institute. We have Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching advocate. And we have W.B. Du Bois, who's going to eventually be instrumental in founding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois are going to become kind of enemies in a way. They see things very differently. Booker T. Washington says, if you get educated as a black man, as a black person, then the whites will respect you and you will be integrated into society. W. Du Bois says, no, we're not waiting for education. We want it right now, and there's no reason why we should have to wait. So they have very different leadership types going on at this time. Now, while this is all going on, we have the Exodus movement. Now, y'all may remember the book of Exodus in the Bible, some of you. Exodus is leaving. They're moving along. They're getting out of there. In this case, we're talking about the Israelites leaving Egypt and headed to the promised land. The Exodusters during this time period are black folks, African Americans, former slaves that are moving away from the South and they're moving into the North. Most of these folks are moving to Kansas at this time. There will be another movement several decades down the road during the Great Depression, which is going to be called the Great Migration. And most of those African-American folks are going to be moving into northern cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, and things of that nature. But this one is called the Exodusters, and they're primarily moving to Kansas to claim free land because we have the Homestead Act of 1862 that promises free land for African-Americans. Now, during this time, we're also dealing with Native Americans, the Indian Wars from about 1862 through 1876. That's the primary focal point of the Indian Wars. And you're going to have a lot of African Americans joining the military during this time. You may have heard the term Buffalo Soldier, which refers to African Americans in the United States Army or cavalry. That's the name that was given to them by the Indians. The reason being because, of course, their dark color of skin and their hair, and of course their fierceness in battle reminded the Indians of the buffalo. So we have the Indian Wars kind of kick off in Minnesota during the American Civil War, the Sioux Uprising, which is pretty devastating. Actually, it's going to call a lot of Union soldiers off the fronts in Virginia and send them out to Minnesota to put down this Indian rebellion. But that's not where it ends. It's going to go further and further, and basically it ends, for all practical purposes, 1874 in Texas. The Comanche are put down in Palo Duro Canyon. But that is not the real end, because just a couple of years later, the Sioux are back on the warpath, and you may remember the name George Armstrong Custer. He was a general during the Civil War, but by now he's been demoted to lieutenant colonel, and he leads his men against the Sioux at a place called Little Bighorn in Montana, and there he will meet his end with about 274-ish soldiers that are going to be killed alongside him. And I guess you could call it the most one-sided victory during the Indian Wars, with the Indians, of course, winning that confrontation. One of the main ways that the Indian Wars are going to be settled is by destroying what the Indians rely on, and that is the buffalo herds. We have the Indian Wars are going to be put down primarily, not militarily, but because we are going to destroy the Indians' ability to hunt buffalo, because we're going to destroy the buffalo for the most part, which is pretty terrible. The buffalo are going to be almost exterminated, but thankfully they will come back. And today the buffalo that we have are actually pretty good numbers. They're no longer endangered. And there's lots of wild buffalo roaming. I've actually seen them in person at a place called Yellowstone. It's pretty amazing. But there are buffalo out there, and thankfully they were not completely exterminated. Now, we also have, during this time period, not just the Indian Wars going on out west, but we have people who are settling in the West. And there are different types of people who are settling in the West. One of the types of people that are settling in the West are the cattlemen, the people who are raising herds of cattle and selling them in the market. We have our city, Fort Worth, is going to have a great claim to fame by being one of the stops on the trail drives to take those cattle on those ranches down in South Texas and Southwest Texas and even other areas west of here, where they're driven from their ranches to the market, looking for the railroad that's going to take them back east to be processed, mostly in Chicago. Now, Fort Worth's history is pretty unique here because it doesn't take but just a few years, and Fort Worth also has the railroad, and so most of those cattle will be brought into Fort Worth instead, and they'll be shipped out of here. And we have our stockyards that you guys may recall. We have stockyards down the north side of Fort Worth, and that is where these cattle will be processed after the end of the cattle drives, which for all practical purposes ends about 1876. There'll be a few more after that, but that's mainly the time period for the cattle drives. We have farmers who are coming out here just to grow crops, mostly in the Kansas area, what we call the Midwest today. That was the West back in the day. The farmers are going to have a pretty hard time of it. The farmers are going to suffer a lot. The ground, the farming techniques used out in Kansas and the Midwest, the Great Plains, is very different from what they're used to, where it rains a lot and the ground is soft. They're going to have to find new ways to farm this land, and a lot of the stuff they're going to do is going to lead to problems several decades down the road. We'll get to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, but just kind of be waiting for that. Okay, so on the national political scene, we have the three major political parties at this time. We have the Democrats and Republicans. We all know who the Democrats and Republicans are. During this time, Republicans are mainly in favor of big business. They are in the banker side, industrial side, they're management, they're pro-gold for the gold standard. They don't want paper money out there because paper money they see devalues their investments. We have Democrats who are pushing for silver. In some cases, they're for paper money. They are for lower tariffs, which are for the people, not for the business. And so we have that kind of conflict going on already as early as the 1860s and 70s. Now, we also have a new political party that comes on the scene that is mostly representative of the farmers, the Populist Party. They were, for all practical purposes, they were socialists. They wanted the government to own the railroads, the telephone, the telegraph. They wanted the unlimited coinage of silver, which would reduce the value of currency and give farmers more money to do more things, to buy more land, to buy more crops, and other pro-farmer legislation that they were in favor of that would help farmers specifically. Now, eventually, the Populist Party is going to merge in with the Democratic Party, but that takes about a decade or so for that to take place. Briefly, the presidents during this time period, we start with Rutherford B. Hayes, the president who comes in at the Great Compromise at the end of the end of Reconstruction. Republicans are going to dominate during this time period, and Rutherford B. Hayes doesn't really do a whole lot, and he's generally seen as corrupt, and he's going to be succeeded in office by James Garfield, who's going to be assassinated in 1881. Another guy who was seen as a kind of a corrupt official, kickbacks, bribes, and things of that nature. And his vice president was seen to be even more corrupt, Chester Arthur. But the funny thing is when Chester Arthur comes in, he actually is going to push for some reform. So he's not as corrupt as people had originally thought he was. He's followed by Grover Cleveland in 1885, the only president who has served 2 non-consecutive terms. He ran and was elected in 1884, and then he comes back and is elected in 1892 with a president in between him, which is Benjamin Harrison, which we'll talk about in just a second. But a lot of these guys really aren't doing much. They're pushing for higher tariffs. They're pro-big business. There's very limited reform being made during this time period. These guys, a lot of people think they're bought out by big business because remember, during the Gilded Age, we had those big business owners like John Rockefeller and Carnegie and all that, who are suspected of paying off officials and things of that nature. So Benjamin Harrison, the last president during this time period, or the last president we're going to talk about during this time period, he does sign the Sherman Antitrust Act, which has a limited ability to control some of the trust, but it's going to backfire and it won't be really instituted into the way it's supposed to be used until Teddy Roosevelt comes into office later on down the road. All right, so let's finish up with the farmers movement. We have the farmers who are going to form the Grange. It's a club for farmers who are lonely. They're looking for some kind of a social life. By the 1890s-ish, they're going to have almost 1 million members. They're going to create a political side of their club called the Farmers Alliance, which will eventually create the People's Party, also called the Populist. And they're going to run presidents, James Weaver in 92, and they'll run William Jennings Bryan in 1896. Now, they don't win these elections, but they're going to bring the farmers' issues to the forefront, which is very important for the farmers. The farmers are going to say, hey, we've got problems. We need you guys to look at us and take care of us. Because remember, at this time, more people are farmers than any other thing in job market. I mean, the job markets in industrialization cities and things, people are moving to the cities, but the farmers still outnumber them somewhat at this time. So farmers issues are going to be listened to somewhat, and that movement will grow and of course eventually be merged in with the Democratic Party, and they'll have limited success. At least on the state and local level, they'll have a lot more success on the national level. So we'll get more into that later on. So that's kind of the end of the Gilded Age, and the next thing we'll be talking about is the Imperialist period, and we'll talk about how America expanded, and the time periods are going to kind of overlap with the Gilded Age. So even though we call it a different thing, it's a different topic. It's more dealing with foreign policy than the domestic policy here in the United States for the people. All right, we'll see you at the next time.